Kenji Nakamura was halfway through his cantaloupe when the first piece of food hit his back. The slice of pizza left a grease stain on his white button-down shirt, the kind his grandmother ironed every morning before he left for Lincoln High. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the laughter erupting from the popular kids' table, just continued eating his melon with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. "Look at that weird kid eating fruit for lunch," Brandon Mitchell announced to his crew, his voice carrying across the cafeteria like he was performing for an audience, and he was. Brandon Mitchell, captain of the football team, 6'2", and built like the college recruiters who visited him weekly, always had an audience when he decided to remind everyone why he ruled Lincoln High's social hierarchy. Kenji took another bite of cantaloupe, sweet, perfect ripeness. His grandmother had taught him how to select fruit at the Korean market downtown, how to press gently near the stem to test for give, how to smell for that perfect balance of sugar and freshness. The other students brought processed foods, packaged snacks, cafeteria garbage. Kenji brought real food prepared with care. "Yo, melon boy," Brandon called out, his voice rising above the general cafeteria noise. "You gonna answer me or just sit there like a weirdo?" The cafeteria was going quiet now, that predatory silence that descended when sharks smelled blood in the water. 300 students sensed entertainment approaching, the kind of social destruction that would be talked about for weeks and shared on social media until the victim transferred schools or graduated, whichever came first. Kenji took another bite, chewed slowly, swallowed. What the cafeteria full of students didn't know, what Brandon Mitchell and his crew couldn't possibly understand, was that Kenji Nakamura had been eating lunch alone by choice for 3.5 years. Not because he was friendless or socially awkward, but because solitude was safer for everyone around him. They also didn't know that the quiet Japanese-American kid who brought homemade meals and read during lunch breaks was the son of Hiroshi Nakamura, former Special Forces operative turned private military contractor, a man who'd taught his son that violence was a tool to be used with surgical precision and devastating effectiveness. Most importantly, they didn't know that Kenji had been suppressing reflexes that could end lives since he was old enough to walk. That every day of restraint was a conscious choice to be normal instead of the weapon his father had trained him to become. Brandon Mitchell was about to learn why some quiet kids stay quiet. Hey, a French fry bounced off Kenji's temple, then another. The football team was warming up, treating him like target practice while Brandon orchestrated the show. Kenji set down his plastic fork and looked up for the first time. His dark eyes swept across the cafeteria, cataloging faces, positions, exit routes, old habits. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow it cut through the noise like a blade. "Please stop." The laughter got louder. Brandon stood up from his table, all 6'2" of entitled athlete, and started walking over. His crew followed like a pack of wolves who'd found wounded prey. "Please stop," Brandon mocked in a high-pitched voice. "What are you gonna do if I don't, fruit boy? Throw your melon at me?" Kenji's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his fork. Metal bent under the pressure, plastic handle cracking with a sound like breaking bones. "I asked nicely," he said, still not raising his voice. Brandon reached Kenji's table and leaned down, putting his face inches from the smaller boys. Up close, the size difference was even more dramatic. Brandon had 50 pounds and 6 inches on Kenji, plus the confidence that came from never losing a fight, never facing real consequences, never meeting anyone who could make him face the reality of what violence actually looked like. "And I'm telling you to eat somewhere else, freak. This is our section." Kenji looked up at Brandon with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than 17. When he smiled, something cold moved behind his expression, like winter wind through empty trees. "Okay," he said quietly. Then he stood up. The transformation happened in the space between heartbeats. One moment, Kenji Nakamura was the quiet, weird kid who ate fruit for lunch and never bothered anyone. The next, he was something else entirely. Something that made the air in the cafeteria feel suddenly thin and dangerous. Brandon Mitchell had been bullying kids since middle school. He knew the choreography of intimidation, understood how smaller kids were supposed to react when faced with superior size and social power. They were supposed to back down, apologize, maybe cry a little if he was lucky. They weren't supposed to stand up and smile like they knew something he didn't. That's more like it, Brandon said, mistaking Kenji's compliance for surrender. Maybe now you'll learn too. You should have stopped when I asked. Kenji interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying a weight that made several nearby students unconsciously step backward. Brandon's crew spread out behind him. Marcus Webb, Tyler Santos, and Jake Morrison, all varsity athletes who'd spent years learning that physical intimidation solved most problems. They'd cornered dozens of kids in this exact formation, turned lunch periods into power displays that reinforced their position at the top of Lincoln High's brutal social ecosystem. None of them had ever cornered Kenji Nakamura before. "What did you just say to me?" Brandon's voice rose, drawing more attention from across the cafeteria. Phone cameras started appearing, students sensing that something bigger than usual harassment was about to unfold. Kenji began gathering his lunch items with methodical precision, thermos cap screwed on tight, napkin folded neatly, cantaloupe container sealed. His movements were economical, purposeful, like a soldier preparing equipment before a mission. "I said you should have stopped when I asked nicely," he repeated, still not looking up from his lunch bag. "My grandmother taught me that politeness should always come first, but my father taught me what comes second. Is that supposed to scare me?" Brandon laughed, but the sound was forced now, theatrical. Something in Kenji's demeanor was setting off alarm bells that Brandon's privileged brain couldn't quite process. "My father fought in 3 wars," Kenji said conversationally, zipping his lunch bag closed with the same careful attention he'd given his meal. "He told me that violence is like medicine. The right dose at the right time can solve problems, but too much can kill people." The cafeteria was completely silent now. Even the lunch staff had stopped serving to watch the confrontation unfold. "He also told me," Kenji continued, finally looking up to meet Brandon's eyes, "that some people only understand one language." Brandon's face flushed red. Being lectured by the weird fruit kid in front of half the school was not how this was supposed to go. His reputation, his social standing, everything that made him important at Lincoln High was built on the understanding that he was the apex predator in this environment. "You think you're tough because your daddy told you war stories," Brandon snarled, shoving Kenji's shoulder hard enough to make him take a step back. "This isn't some foreign country, you little freak. This is my school, and you're about to learn what happens to people who disrespect me." Kenji absorbed the shove without resistance, let his body move with the force instead of fighting it. Basic physics, conservation of energy. His father had taught him that yielding could be more powerful than resistance, that the best fighters knew when to give ground and when to take it. "I tried to warn you," he said softly. Brandon drew his fist back, telegraphing the punch with all the subtlety of a freight train. In his mind, he was about to deliver the knockout blow that would cement his legend at Lincoln High, the moment when Brandon Mitchell proved that social hierarchy was backed by physical dominance. He had no idea he was about to become a cautionary tale. The punch came forward with all of Brandon's strength behind it, aimed at Kenji's face with the intent to humiliate as much as hurt. Brandon had thrown hundreds of punches in his 17 years, in football practice, in gym class scuffles, in the kind of casual violence that popular kids inflicted on their inferiors. This was the first punch he'd ever thrown at someone who'd been trained to kill. Kenji moved, not fast. There was nothing flashy or theatrical about his response. He simply shifted his weight, angled his body, and let Brandon's fist pass through empty air while simultaneously stepping forward into the larger boy's guard. What happened next took less than a second, but would be replayed in slow motion on social media for months afterward. Kenji's right hand came up in a precise strike that connected with Brandon's throat just below the Adam's apple. The blow was delivered with surgical accuracy, targeting the exact pressure point his father had shown him on anatomical charts when Kenji was 12 years old and asking why some techniques were forbidden in their training sessions. Because, his father had said, these are not for practice. These are for when someone's life depends on ending a threat immediately. The strike crushed Brandon's trachea with the efficiency of a medical procedure. No wasted motion, no excess force, just the exact amount of pressure needed to collapse the airway and sever the connection between brain and lungs. Brandon's eyes went wide with shock and terror as he realized he couldn't breathe. His hands flew to his throat, clawing at his neck as if he could somehow reopen the passages that Kenji's strike had sealed. He tried to speak, to call for help, but only a wet gurgling sound emerged. The cafeteria erupted into chaos. Students screamed, chairs scraped against floors as people scrambled to get away from what they were witnessing. Someone was shouting for a teacher, someone else was calling 911, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. Kenji stood perfectly still, watching Brandon collapse to his knees and then fall forward onto the cafeteria floor. The football captain's body convulsed once, twice, then went completely motionless. 3 seconds, one strike, game over. The silence that followed Brandon Mitchell's collapse was unlike anything Lincoln High had ever experienced. 300 students stood frozen, their phones still recording, their minds trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The quiet, weird kid, the one who ate fruit and never bothered anyone, had just killed the most popular student in school with what looked like a gentle tap to the throat. "Oh my God," someone whispered. Then louder, "Oh my God." Panic erupted like a dam bursting. Students trampled over each other trying to reach the exits, screaming and crying and shouting for help. Tables overturned, trays scattered, the careful order of lunch period dissolved into pure chaos. Through it all, Kenji Nakamura stood motionless beside Brandon's body, his lunch bag still clutched in his left hand, his expression completely neutral. He looked down at the boy he'd just killed with the same detached interest he might show a math problem he'd finished solving. Kenji, Mrs. Patterson, the cafeteria supervisor, pushed through the crowd of fleeing students. She was an elderly woman who'd worked at Lincoln High for 30 years, who'd seen fights and food poisoning and every kind of adolescent drama imaginable. She'd never seen a student die. "What happened? What did you do?" Kenji looked up at her with those dark, too old eyes. He wouldn't stop when I asked politely. He said, as if that explained everything. Brandon's crew, Marcus, Tyler, and Jake had backed away during the initial chaos, but now they were edging closer, their shock giving way to rage and the kind of pack mentality that made teenage boys do stupid things. "You killed him," Marcus said, his voice shaking with disbelief and fury. "You actually killed Brandon." "Yes," Kenji agreed matter-of-factly. "He was going to hurt me, so I stopped him." "Stopped him?" Tyler's voice cracked. "You murdered him." "I defended myself," Kenji corrected, his tone remaining conversational despite the accusations. "My father taught me that there's a difference." Jake Morrison, who'd been Brandon's best friend since elementary school, took a step forward with his fists clenched. "Your father taught you to be a psycho killer. My father taught me to end threats efficiently," Kenji replied. Brandon Mitchell was a threat. Now he isn't. The casual way he discussed ending another human being sent fresh waves of terror through the remaining students. This wasn't how teenage fights were supposed to work. There should have been shoving, maybe a few thrown punches, teachers breaking it up, everyone getting suspended. There shouldn't have been a dead body on the cafeteria floor. Sirens wailed in the distance. Police, paramedics, maybe SWAT teams for all anyone knew. Someone had called 911 during the chaos, reported a murder at Lincoln High. Within minutes, the school would be locked down, parents would be panicking, news crews would be setting up outside. But in the eye of the storm, Kenji remained perfectly calm. "You're insane," Jake said, tears streaming down his face as he stared at his best friend's motionless body. "Brandon was just messing with you. That's what he does. He messes with people." "He chose to escalate," Kenji said. "I chose to finish it." Mrs. Patterson was trying to perform CPR on Brandon, but even she could see it was hopeless. The boy's face was already turning blue, his eyes staring sightlessly at the cafeteria ceiling. Whatever Kenji had done to his throat, it wasn't something that could be reversed with chest compressions and mouth. "The police are coming," she told Kenji, her voice shaking. You need to put your hands up or something. Show them you're not dangerous." Kenji tilted his head slightly, considering her suggestion. "But I am dangerous, Mrs. Patterson. That's the point." More students were filming now, the initial shock wearing off enough for them to remember that they were witnessing something historic. The quiet Asian kid who just killed the football captain with one strike would be viral within hours, analyzed by experts, dissected by psychologists, turned into a cautionary tale about the dangers of bullying. But none of them understood what they'd really seen. They thought they'd witnessed a victim finally snapping. A bullied kid who'd learned karate or taken some self-defense classes and gotten lucky with a perfect strike. They had no idea that Kenji Nakamura had been trained from childhood by a man who'd killed more people than most soldiers, that every day of his life had been spent suppressing instincts that could turn him into a one-person army. They didn't know that Brandon Mitchell hadn't been killed by a lucky strike or a moment of rage. He'd been executed by someone who'd calculated exactly how much force was needed, exactly where to apply it, exactly what the consequences would be. And most importantly, they didn't know that Kenji felt no remorse whatsoever for what he'd done. "Why?" Jake asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you have to kill him?" Kenji looked at Jake with something that might have been pity. "Because that's what happens to predators when they choose the wrong prey." The cafeteria doors burst open as the first police officers arrived, their weapons drawn, shouting for everyone to get down. Students screamed and dropped to the floor, hands over their heads, trying to make themselves invisible. Kenji set his lunch bag down carefully on the nearest table and raised his hands above his head. Not because he was surrendering, surrender implied fear, and Kenji wasn't afraid of the police or jail, or whatever consequences awaited him. He raised his hands because it was the polite thing to do, and his grandmother had always taught him to be polite. "Are you the suspect?" the lead officer shouted, his service weapon trained on Kenji's center mass. "I'm the person who defended himself," Kenji replied calmly. "Brandon Mitchell chose to attack me. I chose to make sure he couldn't do it again. Get on the ground now." Kenji complied, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid triggering any nervous reflexes from the armed officers surrounding him. As he knelt beside Brandon's corpse, he could hear Mrs. Patterson trying to explain what had happened, could hear other students sobbing and shouting contradictory accounts. None of it mattered. The security cameras had recorded everything. The investigation would be thorough. The truth would come out eventually. Brandon Mitchell, star athlete and apex predator of Lincoln High's social hierarchy, had chosen to physically assault a quiet student who'd been eating lunch alone. In response, that student had killed him with a single, precisely delivered strike to the throat. Self-defense, the lawyers would argue. Excessive force, the prosecutors would counter. Tragic accident, some would claim. Cold blooded murder, others would insist. But as Kenji felt the cold metal of handcuffs closing around his wrists, he knew exactly what it was: justice. The holding cell at Lincoln County Juvenile Detention was designed to be intimidating. Stark concrete walls, fluorescent lights that hummed constantly, the smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with fear and desperation. Kenji sat on the narrow bench with perfect posture, his hands folded in his lap, looking like he was waiting for a bus rather than facing murder charges. It had been 6 hours since Brandon Mitchell died on the cafeteria floor. 6 hours of questioning, processing, medical examinations, and psychological evaluations. The authorities were trying to understand what they were dealing with: a traumatized victim who'd snapped under pressure, or something much more dangerous. Detective Sarah Martinez had seen plenty of juvenile violence in her 15 years on the force, but she'd never encountered anyone quite like Kenji Nakamura. Most kids arrested for serious crimes were either hysterical with remorse or defiant with bravado. Kenji was neither. He answered questions with polite precision, showed no emotion beyond mild interest, and spoke about killing another human being like he was discussing the weather. His father's Hiroshi Nakamura. She told her partner, Detective James Wright, as they reviewed the case files outside Kenji's cell. Former Special Forces, multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now he runs a private security company that trains corporate executives and government officials. Wright whistled low. Military family. That explains the kid's composure. It explains more than that. Martinez held up a photograph from Hiroshi's military record. This guy has more confirmed kills than most entire units. If he's been training his son, then we're not dealing with a bullied kid who got lucky. Wright finished. We're dealing with a weapon. The door to Kenji's cell opened with a mechanical clank. His father walked in, still wearing the business suit he'd been in when the call came from Lincoln High. Hiroshi Nakamura was smaller than his son would eventually become, but he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived situations where hesitation meant death. Kenji? He said simply, sitting down on the bench beside his son. Father. Kenji's posture somehow became even more perfect. I'm sorry to bring shame to our family. Hiroshi studied his son's face for a long moment. Tell me what happened. Kenji recounted the events with the same factual precision he'd shown the police. No embellishments, no justifications, just a clinical description of escalation and response. When he finished, his father was quiet for nearly a minute. You used the throat strike I taught you, Hiroshi said finally. Yes, sir. I told you that technique was only for life-threatening situations. Brandon Mitchell was much larger than me. He had 3 friends with him. He initiated physical violence after verbal threats. Kenji's voice remained steady. I calculated a significant probability of serious injury if the confrontation continued. Hiroshi nodded slowly. His son had analyzed the situation like a tactical problem and solved it with appropriate force. The mathematics of violence applied with surgical precision. The boy is dead. He said, Yes, sir. How do you feel about that? Kenji considered the question with the same careful attention he gave everything else. I feel satisfied that the threat was neutralized. I feel sad that Brandon Mitchell chose to force a violent resolution. I feel concerned about the legal consequences. Do you feel guilty? No, sir. Hiroshi had feared this conversation for years, had hoped that normal childhood experiences might temper the predatory instincts he'd trained into his son. But Kenji had never been a normal child, and Lincoln High had never been a normal environment. The prosecutors want to try you as an adult. His father said, murder in the 2nd degree. I understand. Your lawyer thinks we can get it reduced to manslaughter with a self-defense argument, maybe juvenile detention until you're 18, then probation. And what do you think? Hiroshi looked at his son, 17 years old, facing decades in prison, having just killed another human being, and saw himself at the same age before the military had given his violence purpose and structure. "I think you are my son," he said quietly, and I think Brandon Mitchell made the mistake of believing that cruelty had no consequences. Outside the cell, Detective Martinez was watching the conversation through one-way glass, trying to read the body language between father and son. Neither showed any emotion, any distress, any of the normal human reactions to tragedy that she'd learned to expect. "Jesus," Wright muttered beside her. "It's like watching two robots discuss a malfunctioning toaster." "It's worse than that," Martinez said. "It's like watching two predators decide if the kill was clean." The psychological evaluation report landed on her desk an hour later. Dr. Patricia Chen, the county's leading child psychologist, had spent 3 hours with Kenji and emerged with more questions than answers. "He shows no signs of trauma, no indicators of mental illness, no evidence of psychological dysfunction," she wrote. "His responses are consistent with someone who has been systematically trained to view violence as a problem-solving tool. He demonstrates tactical thinking, emotional regulation under stress, and complete absence of remorse for actions he considers justified." The conclusion was buried in clinical language, but Martinez understood what Dr. Chen was really saying. Kenji Nakamura wasn't broken or damaged or mentally ill. He was functioning exactly as he'd been designed to function. He was a weapon that had been pointed at the wrong target. The media circus began within hours of Brandon's death. News vans surrounded Lincoln High. Reporters interviewed sobbing students. Parents demanded answers about school safety and bullying policies. The story had everything modern journalism craved: dead teenager, martial arts, quiet kid turned killer, immigrant family with military background. But the narrative that emerged in the first 48 hours was completely wrong. The press painted Kenji as a victim who'd finally snapped after years of abuse. A tragic figure driven to violence by systemic bullying and institutional indifference. Social media exploded with support for the Melon Boy, with hashtags demanding justice for students who'd been pushed too far by predatory classmates. None of them understood that Kenji hadn't been victimized by Brandon Mitchell. He'd been hunting him. The security footage told a different story than the one being broadcast on every news channel. Frame-by-frame analysis showed Kenji's mechanical calm during the confrontation, his precise positioning, the way he'd calculated angles and distances before delivering the killing blow. This wasn't self-defense, Martinez told the district attorney during their case review meeting. This was an execution. "Can you prove that?" Martinez pulled up the enhanced footage on her laptop. "Watch his eyes. He's not scared, not angry, not reacting emotionally at all. He's problem-solving." The DA studied the screen, watching Kenji's face during the moments before Brandon's death. No fear, no rage, no human emotion at all. Just cold calculation. "The kid's been trained to kill," Martinez continued. "His father's military record reads like a handbook for creating human weapons. This wasn't bullying that got out of hand. This was a predator finally finding prey stupid enough to give him legal justification. But proving intent in court would be nearly impossible." Kenji had followed the letter of self-defense law. He'd been physically attacked. He'd responded with force. He'd stopped when the threat was neutralized. The fact that he'd responded with lethal efficiency didn't change the legal mathematics. Brandon Mitchell had thrown the first punch. Everything else was just consequences. 18 months later, Kenji Nakamura walked out of Lincoln County Juvenile Detention with a bachelor's degree completed through correspondence courses, fluency in 3 additional languages, and a full scholarship to MIT. The manslaughter conviction had been sealed when he turned 18, his record wiped clean by a legal system that preferred rehabilitation narratives to uncomfortable truths about what some people were capable of. The media had moved on to other tragedies, other outraged hashtags, other viral moments of violence. Brandon Mitchell was a footnote now, a cautionary tale about bullying that parents shared with their children and teachers used in sensitivity training seminars. But Lincoln High hadn't forgotten. The school had installed metal detectors, hired additional security, implemented zero-tolerance policies that treated food fights and murder threats with equal severity. A memorial plaque honored Brandon's memory in the main hallway, right next to the trophy case where his football achievements were displayed. Nobody mentioned that Brandon Mitchell had died because he'd mistaken a weapon for a victim. Kenji's father was waiting in the parking lot, standing beside a black sedan with government plates. Hiroshi had aged in the 18 months since his son's arrest, gray touching his temples, new lines around his eyes. "How do you feel?" he asked as Kenji approached. "Free," Kenji replied, which was true in multiple ways. Free from incarceration, free from the pretense of being normal, free from the exhausting charade of pretending to be just another high school student. "The offer from the State Department is still available," Hiroshi said. "They're interested in your unique skill set." Kenji nodded. He'd expected as much. The government had ways of identifying and recruiting people with particular talents, especially when those people had demonstrated their capabilities in such dramatic fashion. What about MIT? MIT will always be there. Opportunities to serve your country in specialized roles don't come along often. Kenji understood. The choice wasn't really about college versus government service. It was about whether he wanted to spend his life pretending to be normal or embracing what he actually was. "There will be others like Brandon Mitchell," his father continued. "People who mistake courtesy for weakness, who believe that cruelty has no consequences. The world is full of predators who need to be reminded that they're not at the top of the food chain. And you think I should be the one to remind them?" Hiroshi looked at his son, 19 years old now, calm and controlled and completely without remorse for the life he'd taken. "I think you already decided that when you were 17 years old, eating cantaloupe in a high school cafeteria." Kenji smiled, the same cold expression that had been the last thing Brandon Mitchell ever saw. "I'll take the government position." As they drove away from Lincoln County Juvenile Detention, Kenji thought about the lunch he'd been eating when Brandon Mitchell made his fatal mistake. Sweet cantaloupe, perfectly ripe, prepared with care by his grandmother, who believed that food should be treated with respect. He wondered if his new government colleagues would understand that courtesy and violence weren't opposites. They were complementary tools in the hands of someone who knew how to use both. The world was full of bullies who'd never learned that some quiet people stay quiet for everyone else's protection. Kenji Nakamura was about to remind them why that was important, one carefully calculated strike at a time. 3 months later, a leaked government document would reference an operative known only as Melon, someone who could eliminate Hive. U targets with precision that made seasoned assassins look like amateurs. The document would be quickly classified, buried in bureaucratic red tape, forgotten by everyone except the people who needed to remember that some weapons looked like college students and some predators hunted other predators. Brandon Mitchell had wanted to be remembered as Lincoln High's king. Instead, he became a lesson about choosing your victims carefully, because sometimes the quiet kid eating lunch alone isn't hiding from bullies, he's protecting them from himself.